Hi, and thanks for joining me today. Today we're going to be talking about kinesiology, or how the muscles move the bones in the three planes of movement. And you probably know by now that the way I teach sequencing involves understanding whether the bone is in neutral orientation or an external rotation, and understanding whether the joint is in flexion or extension. But how do we get into flexion and extension? That's where kinesiology comes into play. Kinesiology is the study of the way that we move, and it can help us to understand why the joint is moving in and out of flexion. I don't feel that yoga teachers need to know the scientific term of every muscle in the body or their origins. I feel that yoga teachers need to have a healthy understanding of how the muscles are moving the bones in their joints, but that's about it. So I'm going to be talking very plainly today, but you can feel free to educate yourself in any additional ways that you think would be helpful for you. Typically, when I'm teaching my sequencing, I'm looking at the primary joint structures, the pelvis and the shoulders. All movement originates from the pelvis and the shoulders, and therefore those are the primary joint structures that I am concerned with. When I am in a neutral orientation in my hip socket, that means my femur is in a neutral orientation. My pelvis is always an anatomical neutral. It's the femur that moves from neutral to external rotation, or from neutral to internal rotation. Now, you might remember we don't have a lot of internal rotation in yoga, but it's important to understand the concept nonetheless. When our bone moves in the hip socket, it changes the muscles that are going to be involved in its extension or flexion. So let's take a look at extension and flexion in the pelvis from the perspective of kinesiology. When I am in flexion, my center quadricep and my psoas are contracting. This is bringing my leg into flexion. It's actually bringing my pelvis into flexion because flexion occurs at the joint. Flexion is all about the range of motion that the joint can move through. And so if my thigh is coming towards my torso, then that means that my pelvis is in flexion. When my thigh moves away from my torso into extension, what that really means is that the pelvis is moving into extension. How do we move the pelvis into extension? Well, we have to move the femur bone away from the front of the body. We have to move it back. Well, the things that move the femur bone back into extension are our glutes and our hamstrings. Typically, our student population is going to be sitting at a desk working in some capacity with a computer or something that requires them to be seated. Unless your student population is largely based in the service industry, your students are going to be coming to you from jobs that require them to sit all day long. When we sit, our hip flexors become tight because they're in flexion, and our glutes become loose. When we bring postures that require hip extension into our practice, we build the glute muscles. When we see individuals that have weak glute muscles and strong or tight hip flexors, we know that they've been doing a lot of flexion in the pelvis, and we can counter this through extension. The shoulder girdle is similar in this way. When I move my shoulders into flexion, my pectoral muscles turn on and engage. This helps me to bring my shoulders into flexion. When my shoulder is in extension, I'm leveraging the power of latissimus dorsi, teres major, and the posterior deltoid muscles. It's interesting to note that the latissimus dorsi muscle is a stabilizer muscle, and it is involved in both flexion through abduction of the shoulder and extension. Prime movers are the muscles that actually move the joint in its socket. The stabilizer muscles create stability and help us to be balanced. We see this often in the core. We have many layers to our abdominal muscles, and the superficial core, the rectus abdominis, runs the front of the abdomen. The obliques are on either side of this rectus abdominis. The transverse abdominals are around the side waist, almost like a girdle. The transverse abdominis can't be called into action because they're stabilizer muscles. Other muscles have to turn on in order to get them to call into action. So I have to engage my rectus abdominis, which will then call on my obliques and my transverse abdominis. When we move the pelvis into external rotation, one of the muscles that is involved in that action is the piriformis. It's common to have students that have issues with their piriformis, especially runners. The piriformis externally rotates the femur bone in the hip socket, and then the hip flexors come into flexion to bring the joint into flexion itself. And there's a lot of other things going on, and there are a lot of other muscles involved, but these are the major muscles that are responsible for this movement. Many times our students will compensate for weaknesses in their muscular structure. For example, in Warrior II, they may not go as deep or they may not stack their knee. Why would that make a difference? That's because when you stack the knee over the ankle, it ensures that your pelvis is in flexion. Many students compensate for this by letting their torso come forward. When they let their torso come forward, almost like it's swimming towards the top knee, they're actually lessening the flexion that they're getting in the psoas muscle. They're backing off a little bit unconsciously. And this causes them to lose something from the posture. When we encourage our students to engage their muscles completely and in a balanced way, we are helping them to get the most out of their practice. Not only is it the most muscular engagement, but it's the most awareness. And ultimately, if a student doesn't go as deep as they might possibly be able to, it's still okay. Maybe they have an aversion to the sensation that they feel, or maybe it's a little bit too much work for them right now. That's fine. I always say it's more important to give your students the latitude and autonomy to select how they practice than it is to push your students to their limits. There's a danger in pushing students to their limit or to their edge, and I prefer to let students tell me where they're comfortable. This helps them to develop a relationship with their practice that is authentic to them, and it helps them to learn to listen to their body. Ultimately, you don't need to know every single muscle that's moving every single joint in your body. What you do want to know is how these primary joint structures are moving, and you want to be able to identify any issues that might be exacerbated by certain postures. For example, if someone has a piriformis issue, then Warrior II might be uncomfortable for them. If they tell you that their piriformis hurts after a class that's heavily sequenced around external rotation, this might be an indication that their piriformis is inflamed. You can offer them figure 4 or half pigeon and see if that helps. I hope this lecture was helpful. Be well, yogis. Namaste.